Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Cinema 105. This week, we have a great lesson for you, video games. That's right. You've all been waiting for this. An old man talking about video games. Well, here we go. Let's jump in, okay? All right. And I'll just get my screen ready. Video games, week 10. Here we are. Okay, let's get into it. So, what we're going to cover: popularity, importance, the culture, how games affect movies, effects on youth culture, some of the disservices of video games, including violence in video games and gamification. So let's get into it. So, video games, what do they have? Fascinating characters, fabulous visuals. They've gotten incredibly detailed. With every year, they're getting better and better and better. And of course, compelling storylines. They aren't just shoot 'em ups. There's all variety of games, mysteries to solve, adventures to take, treasures to find. Some quotes. Here's Sean White saying, there are plenty of skills I've learned from playing video games. It's more interactive than watching TV. Ray Bradbury, a famous science fiction author, says video games are a waste of time for men with nothing else to do. So we're seeing different opinions, and note that the generations have vastly different perspectives on video games. Those that grew up with them, no surprise, approve. Many older generations don't. And once again, we see technology dividing generations. So let's get some basic statistics. Here we go. Average age of a gamer is 33, not a teenager. That's because those Americans who grew up on games still play them. 68% of players prefer to play with friends. 55% are male, 45% are female. In some numbers, those are even, in some studies, those are even closer. So it's not all males. Let's take note of that. And here we see 65% of American adults play video games. Wow, that's incredible. That's a high percentage of the population. Even grannies are playing video games, including Grand Theft Auto. A new survey from AARP, that's a retired person's committee, finds video games are booming among people 50 plus and even more amongst older women. In this shot, this granny is playing Grand Theft Auto, and she's basically attacking anyone who looks like a banker. There are many different types of games, and more people game than go to movies. So let's take a look at a couple of the games. We got real-time strategy, shooter, multiplayer, role-playing games, simulation and sports, puzzlers and party games, action adventure, survival and horror, platformer, etc. And let's not forget there's chess and backgammon as well. So there's a wide variety of what constitutes a game. The benefits of gaming over here. 89% believe video game is beneficial to society. Let me get rid of myself. 44% say the most important benefit is improved emotional well-being. So we have a bunch of different benefits that can be seen from gaming: making friends, improving cognitive skills, and of course, fostering creativity. Oh. Okay, so different game genres that we see here. The most popular are action games, fighting games. That's has the highest popularity in America. Action adventure, strategy, casual, all these different types of games you can see here and their various popularities. Game genres. Now, this is an interesting chart. Note the axis of simple versus non-simple, social versus non-social. Okay, so we have some games that are non-social. You're just doing your own thing, like Tetris. You have other games that are social. You're playing against someone or with someone, and some simple to complex. All right. So very interesting breakdown of how games work. It's important to remind us of this because we don't want to generalize too much about games. There's all different types and all different types of players. Most popular games you see here and the numbers that they generate. Let's talk about devices. This is where the game is played. Remember, the medium is the message. The medium determines the environment. Most players play alone in a room with a device connected to the internet, console, PC, or even, let's not forget, mobile games, very popular with people. So And thinking about this, I just want to point out the progression that's occurred. So we initially had in the 70s these private video games where you played with yourself or a friend at home alone. Okay, maybe it was private, public because you shared with a friend. Later on in the 80s, arcade games came out like Pac-Man. Okay, and this was much more public. You played in front of other people, against other people, possibly strangers. People watched you play. Then we went to console games through the 80s into the 2000s. We see the graphics, of course, are getting more sophisticated. Notice this progress here. But also now it's private. It's back in the home. There are arcade games still exist, but they're pretty passe, and most of the games are older games. Now we have console games more private, and then we go to mobile games here in the present, where you can play them anywhere. Again, a very private experience. You don't see a lot of people sharing their phone to play a game. So we got private expression. So handheld games were private, intimate, one user at a time, serve function that cell phones do today, which is being an instant friend, a time filler. You're waiting in line, you're stuck in traffic, bust out the little companion and you have some friendship there, some time wasted. But it's difficult to socialize with. I mean, people would trade their Game Boys and play against one another, but it really meant one person was basically watching and bored while the other person played. Now, compare that to today with the public expression of professional esports. Here's an example of StarCraft players. They earn between $300 and $100,000 a year. Pretty amazing. The top player earned over $1 million. And, this is very popular in South Korea. And these guys, mostly guys, are heroes. They're rock stars with huge contracts and so forth, celebrities. Rise of gaming revenue visualized. We don't have time to go over all of this, but we could see that we had the arcade game kind of fades out. Console and PC, they've also kind of faded out, and mobile has kind of taken over. A lot of people downloading and playing on their phone. We see the progress both from the graphics, okay, but also the devices, the medium through which we absorb games has changed. Video games are the most popular media in the world today. Yeah, that's right. In mid-2021, an estimated 3.1 billion global video game consumers. The world population is 8. So around 40% of the world plays video games. That's more than any other media. I suppose reading in general or books could probably give video games a run, but video games are very popular. So some more information. Video games outperform other entertainment. Take a look at these numbers. Gaming, between console and mobile and all this together, way more than box office. Okay, this is global revenue, not just the US, and even more than music. All right, a lot of people are finding ways to get movies and music for free. I suppose that's true of games, but the income is just vastly different. And this has been happening for a while. I think that this switchover happened in 2013. Play by country. Now we think of the US as being a big video game country, but actually we're below the global average. China, Vietnam, India, Indonesia, much higher than the US, which is kind of interesting. We think of us as having a problem, but really, if there is a problem, it's much larger in China. So services and disservices, we talk about this in this class, okay? So services, obviously entertainment, joy, competition, eye-hand coordination, problem solving, critical thinking, community, and friendship. But some disservices, poor sleep hygiene. Video games have been linked to that. Physical health atrophy, exhaustion, dehydration, obesity and heart problems, aggression, lack of motivation, and depression. All of these things have been shown in various studies to be enhanced by video games. They don't necessarily directly cause it. I mean, if you just keep drinking water, you'll be fine. But video games can lead to that. Now, here's a legend of game design, designer and game director at Nintendo. His name is Shigeru Miyamoto. And here he says, video games are bad for you? That's what they said about rock and roll. He was the inventor of Zelda, and he's been called by Time magazine the Spielberg of video games and the father of modern video games. Here's some of the ones that he's come up with, some of the best-selling titles of all time. So Now we're going to transition. I want to talk about video games and movies because there's this really incredible link between them. We've kind of covered the intro, brought everybody up to speed. Now let's explore the relationship between these two types of media. Video games and movies have a very mutually beneficial relationship. Both media's forms borrow from each other freely for stories, themes, imagery, and aesthetic. That relationship has changed movies. So here we see several movies that were made based on video games. So we're going to explore how movies have been changed, and movie narratives are one example. Video games are action-packed. The action starts immediately. That's the point. Exposition is quick. Now, there are exceptions. Some films have larger expositions, but shooter games in particular, you want to get to the action. Very often, dialogue is expository. In other words, it's not natural. It's just there to advance the story. Most of the characters you're going to meet are enemies to be killed, a person to be used or to get information from, and often not to be trusted. Now, movies are different. Movies develop characters. They're designed to tell a story about characters you've been made to care about. This is done by developing the characters through dialogue and interactions. Scenes of actions are mixed with scenes of character development and plot points. And often games skip this. Character relationships and dialogue. Movies are about developing a relationship through dialogue and shared moments. Relationships in video games are much shorter and very transactional. What can you get from this character that you're meeting in a video game? Are they going to give you some info? Are you going to have to kill them? Do they have weapons? Any conversation held is to gain information or achieve a goal, not to get to know each other. Okay. Transactional relationships. In video games, winning is objective, not making friends. Any decision made is done to progress and win the game. Sometimes emotion or human kindness are not relevant to achieving objectives and may actually get you killed, or your character at least. Storytelling style. So in literature, we see a lot of stuff as third person. Okay, so you're hearing about the events from someone else who knows of them. Cinema, second person, the audience observes the subject. But in games, it's first person. The audience is the subject. That's why it's often shot from a POV. Video games are interactive. It's happening to you, not to someone else. You internalize the death of your character much more. You're much more invested, including in your victories, which are yours alone, not from someone that's a fictional character. Now, one of the aspects that we see sometimes in video games is bad dialogue. Often games have very stilted expository dialogue that only serves to advance the gameplay. Here's a rather hilarious example. In games, dialogue is only necessary in pursuit of game goals. In movies, of course, there are goals as well, but the dialogue is written very carefully to disguise that and make it seem like the characters are just talking and being natural around each other. So moving on, video games and movies. So we talked about how a lot of movies are beginning to look like video games, or they're even about video games. Ready Player One. Okay, movies have been quick to adapt games into movies and adopt the video game aesthetic, packing films with action and simple dialogue just enough to advance the plot to the next fight scene. Is retrieving the game aesthetic. So a lot of movies are beginning to look like video games and have similar levels of action because so many young people are playing video games. Okay, here's an example, Scott Pilgrim versus the World. I don't know if you've seen this movie, but it's a great one. But it's got a total video game aesthetic. It's a comedy. Michael Cera has to fight all these ex-girl boyfriends of his new love. Here we go.
You want to fight me for her? No. I want to fight you for me. Gotta earn the power of self-respect.
Okay, I think you get the idea. If you haven't seen that movie, check it out. Really fun, but it's totally the video game aesthetic brought into a movie. Another example of that is first-person POV films. They're very rare, but in Hardcore Henry, this video game perspective is maintained throughout. Now, some audiences reported feeling nauseous, but others loved it. I mean, the whole entire film is shot from a first person POV. In other words, the camera is the perspective of the character here as he tortures this guy to get some information. So movies have been changed. Video games surpassed movies for revenue in 2013. Now, both of their target audiences are young males, 16 to 30. Why? They spend the most on movies and concessions. That's right. Movie for show, popcorn for dough. Hence, movies began looking like video games, right? Narratives, CGI, and characters all have been influenced. The number one way they make money through movies is through the selling of junk food, much higher profit than the ticket of the movie, which is very expensive to bring to you. CG action scenes are all like video games. This one from the Avengers. Doctor Strange made almost entirely out of CGI, very trippy, very game-like visuals. And narratives abandoned for more action. The John Wick films have the thinnest of plots to have an excuse for more bloody action scenes. But of course, they've made close to 500 million worldwide. So we're going to see more of this. This is what the youth seem to want. This is what they're spending their money on. That's what's going to drive the market. Movie characters have become more superhuman. Okay, obviously superheroes, that's an obvious analogy, but even Matrix, these characters, lots of films you have almost superhuman characters. Also, this concept of regeneration, characters that regenerate or relive or redo events in their life, almost as if like Groundhog Day, getting to go back in time. This is a really common plot that we see in a bunch of different movies. Look at all these different examples: Edge of Tomorrow, Live, Die, Repeat, Groundhog Day, where he lives the day over and over. Altered Carbon was a television show about this very ability to be able to put your new memories into a new body. So all this comes from video games. In a video game, you might die, but then you're just reborn at the same level to fight on and hopefully get better. So this concept, even in very sophisticated movies like Everything Everywhere All at Once, is showing up. Okay, this comes directly from the video game aesthetic. The anime look. Some popular actors seem to have anime-like proportions to their face. Yeah, this sort of speaks for itself, but some of the most popular actresses in particular today look like anime. Video games have become more like movies. The graphics and the scenery obviously look very much like movies, with lighting and effects. So what are the effects of all this? It's changing the taste in movies, diminishing plot and character development for action as in a game. Tends to offer flat stereotypical characters rather than unique round characters. Hyper-competitive antisocial behaviors. And of course, we've seen the decline of adult dramas. Television is really taking that from movies. These two films both won Academy Awards, but when you look at how many people went to see them, it doesn't compare to a film like The Avengers. So this leads us to question one. How have video games influenced modern movie narratives and imagery? That's question one. How have video games influenced modern movie narratives and imagery? We just lectured on that. So moving on. We become what we behold. We shape our tools and then they shape us. Remember, that's one of our original defining concepts in the class. Let's see how that applies to video games. So the hidden effects of video games on society: shortening of attention spans, that's been shown; cyberbullying, social isolation, propagation of sexism, misogyny, normalization of violence, learned behavior and training, gamification of life, and of course, game addiction. Let's get into it. So attention span. Technology has given us a sense of convenience and freedom that was unimaginable just a few decades ago. However, the benefits of the digital revolution don't come without a cost. Our reliance on our devices is altering our cognitive abilities. So this is true for all of our world, not just video games, just to be clear. All the things that are vying for our attention, all our various devices, all the ways that we can distract ourselves are actually leading to shorter attention spans. Today, a game must be designed in a way to grab people's attention almost immediately. From RPGs to online pokies, they are all trying to cater to the instant gratification kind of player. Studies say young children who play video games more than 2 hours a day are 67% more likely than their peers to have attention problems, according to this study. It demonstrates that the brief exposure to violent video games may have negative effect on attention and concentration. Antisocial potential, okay? Video game play is almost always solo, private environment where human distractions are removed. The gamer becomes consumed in the environment, wearing headphones, dazzling visuals. And this is shown to contribute, not create, but contribute to obesity, isolation, and alienation. And of course, no exercise or interaction. So these games are all consuming. Here's an image, very intense, very scary. Again, a POV shot, you're gonna have to kill this guy. Today's games are immersive, audiovisual experiences with fully developed worlds, complete with slang, etiquette, and taboos. In some ways, we might say that they're too powerful. They're almost too captivating. How is normal life or even television going to compare to such intensity that happens continually in a video game? It's not just one action sequence. It's multiple bloody, dangerous, blood pressure raising scene after scene. So game addiction, gaming disorder has become a designated mental disorder with increasing importance over the last 10 years. So it's now in what's called the DSM. This is sort of the Bible of psychiatrists. And it's characterized by increasing priority given to gaming over other activities. This is an actual thing now. Here's an example. Phoenix Suns basketball player DeAndre Jordan will often stay up all night playing video games. Numerous studies have shown that engaging in video games before bedtime leads to poor sleep. Maybe that's why I didn't do so well last year. Addictions and gambling. Games like Candy Crush reward you with goals, so you feel good about yourself. The designers create moving goals so that when you reach one, there's another. Sound familiar? Well, it's like gambling. It's like Vegas, okay? The game is designed to be very cheap. It only costs $0.25. Well, you may not win anything, but it's exciting. Some bells go off, and then maybe you'll lose, but hey, it's cheap. Play again and again and again. It's not just goals that trigger people's addiction. The games are unpredictable in the way they reward players, just like slot machines. We call this persuasive design, and they're designed to keep you coming back for more. So here's a great little piece written by Daniel Fu, a big game player and later scholar. Video game addiction and toxicity also impact the lives of my friends. For me and most of my friends, our addiction stems initially from our competitive nature. We love to win and hated to lose. It was an escape from the stress and pressure we felt from school and other extracurricular activities. Eventually, we played multiple hours almost every day. Gaming became a lifestyle so ingrained that our daily and school lives were greatly impacted. I often fell asleep in class because I had played video games until 3 or 4 a.m. And I didn't do my homework because I was spending all my time gaming. One of my friend's addiction to gaming led to him into a downward spiral where he skipped classes and ultimately had to drop out of school. So another kind of extreme example, but we often learn by looking at extreme examples. Okay, the extremes teach us about the middle. In Japan, 1 million people have shut themselves in the room. They have a term for it, which is hikikomori. This is a shut-in, a person. This is a new manifestation in the culture. The phenomenon is so acute in Japan that it has its own word. The more than 1 million people who do not conform to the country's rigid social expectations are now left with few options, and some hide. Here, a gentleman says, I became scared to go to a nearby supermarket. Okay. This has also come to America. It's not like it's a disease or anything, but the social phenomenon can be seen across the world, really, but in America as well. The American hikikomori now comprise a distinct socially challenged subset of the people not in education, employment, or training. So sometimes called NEETs, not in education, employment, or training. Some researchers have suggested that recreational computer use has contributed to a decrease in young men's participation in the workforce. We have large numbers of people in their early 20s living in the basement bedroom. Oftentimes it is younger men struggling with work, struggling with launching. There's some element of still being stuck in an earlier developmental stage. And here there are thousands of people who go on various Reddits. and choose to stay in the room and not go outside. Another group, slightly off topic, are incels, a self-chosen name for involuntary celibates, young misogynists who gather online to commiserate their lack of romantic or sexual attachment. Very often, these men are also video game players. Not all video game players are incels, but many, if not most, incels turn out to be video game players. Cyberbullying. Gamers do experience online harassment and bullying. Games are ongoing fountain of toxic masculinity, and most gamers experience this at some point. Here we see the charts. How frequently do online gamers experience harassment? So in many examples, they're saying, yeah, quite a bit. That's over 50% are saying yes. Cyberbullying, a recent study revealed that 80% of multiplayer gamers face toxicity in the form of online harassment. Okay. A recent study says that the bullying is on the rise, 7%. A lot of people say this is sort of a hidden problem, that it's going up. As the society experiences stress, like the pandemic, that translates to the youth or just to whoever is playing video games. But only 38% of child victims report their experiences to their parents. So this is an ongoing problem. Another ongoing problem, sexism in video games. Video games have struggled to represent women in realistic ways. Some games lean into sexual representation of women in their characters. Most character options are male. Usually there's 1 to 2 female character choices, all barely dressed. So video game female tropes. You have the damsel in distress, like Zelda we see here. You have the Miss male character, so as the female version of an already established male character. The manic pixie dream girl, a bubbly childlike muse who exists to help the male smile. The evil seductress, and of course, the fighting babe. The hypersexualized, hyper-violent female presents the illusion of female empowerment, but is designed as a sexual fantasy. So we'll see some examples here. Here's the Mr. Man, Miss Man characters. Even Minnie Mouse is the same thing. Bayonetta, Lollipop Chainsaw, Zelda. Are movies that different? I mean, we look at lots of movies and we see this hypersexualization of women, particularly movies that are geared to young men. Female portrayals. Now, this is from Laura Croft, one of the famous and arguably the most famous and popular female character of all time, which was played by boys, it should be noted. But note how the animation has gotten more lifelike and realistic, but the sexualized portrayal has remained constant. Okay, so it got more lifelike, but the proportions and so forth remain constant. The technology progresses while the mentality remains the same. Despite the portrayal, Laura Croft remains one of the few and most popular female characters of all time. It's amazing they could fight in these outfits. Sometimes this will lead to sexist ideation. And what's the most sexist video game of all time? It's called Catherine. And it reveals a lot about misogynist gaming culture. I mean, you can see from these quotes here, whoever wrote this game had a real intent in mind. And these concepts are watched by young men, and they kind of validate these ideas. They introduce them if they haven't been exposed to them before, and just by them being in a video game, they're validating these sort of misogynist thoughts. Toxic masculinity. Nearly all pro gamers are men. And perhaps because of the disproportionate amount of male hardcore players, misogyny is a frequent facet of game content throughout the gaming industry. Sexism and inappropriate behavior towards female gamers are commonplace. Players appear to conform to stereotypical masculine norms and maintain a male dominance hierarchy. In other words, when you get into the gaming world, guys are trying to bully each other that are better players, that are older. And of course, we see a lot of bikini-clad female characters. Now, look at the gender disparity. Here in this survey, 52% male, 48% female, pretty close. But what we see is that the video game developers are almost dominated by men. Okay, it's very interesting. The hardcore players, the professionals, and it looks like the developers are coming more from men. And this may be accounting for the tropes and the misogyny that we see. The video game industry seems to base much of its game and character design on a few assumptions. Among them, that girls don't play big action games. Not true. Boys won't play games with strong female characters. Not true. And male players like the sexual objectification of female characters, probably mixed. Now, some gamers are tired of the sexism. Many teenage boys are tired of the sexualized depiction of women in video games, according to findings in a new study. 1,400 US youths agreed that women are treated as sex objects too often in games. The findings counter assumptions. 70% of girls and 70% of boys said it does not matter what the gender of the lead character is. Indeed, the lasting popularity of Lara Croft and others should perhaps have hinted at this direction. Okay. So what we see is video games changing. A more woke consciousness is being introduced, a more respect for LGBTQ characters, more respect for women, maybe greater racial disparity. Another issue in games is many times the characters are just white. So all of this sort of consciousness that we see coming into other media is coming into games. But some gamers are pushing back. Other games have pushed back on calls for more equality. Much like the larger society, gamers are being pushed into tribes with defined speech and thought patterns. Here we see a group of people saying that, warning, non-snowflake gaming experience ahead. We consider the woke movement in gaming insulting and pandering and so on and so forth. So there's backlash. Here's a couple of different examples, differing opinions within the community. It's her game now. Sega bets it all on woke gamers. Okay. Hypocrisy, how women are treated differently in gaming. Western washing, how woke narcissism ruins gaming. So we're seeing both opinions expressed, shall we say, much like the larger society. Why does it matter? Possible effects of sexism in games. Creates unrealistic notions of femininity. Promotes sexist attitudes and language. That's not good. Objectification leads to misogyny. Alienates female gamers, of which there are many. May lead to difficulty in relating to women later in life. If you develop this sort of sexual or sexist language and attitudes, that's not going to play well when you get older and are in more sophisticated environments. And it creates a bad reputation for gamers. And that might be why we see a lot of companies, they don't want to give up that 45, 48% of their audience that are women. They want to attract them. And if they have to upset a few, maybe 20% of the anti-woke gamers, I think financially they're willing to do it. So this leads us to the second question. Reflecting on the lecture, what hidden effects have video games had on youth culture? Okay, question 2, everybody, for your discussion. Reflecting on the lecture you just heard, what hidden effects have video games had on youth culture? All right, I'm going to move on. Okay, a couple more issues. Violence in video games. This is a big one. Video games, a player gets to commit the most egregious acts of human behavior freely. Nowhere else is this permitted. You can freely talk about, you can't even freely talk about committing acts that you commit in a game. If you say you're going to shoot the president or kill someone and people overheard it, and definitely if it gets recorded, you can get in trouble for that. But in video games, you can do whatever you want, which is part of the appeal. Many researchers have concluded that playing violent video games, just like watching violence on television, does correlate with an increase in aggressive behavior, cognition, and tolerance of violence. Here we see a very violent example from a video game. However, other research has shown that while violent video games may be related to increased aggression in the laboratory, it is not a significant predictor of real-world violence or violent crime. So they haven't been able to make a direct correlation between violent behavior and aggression in a video game to actually going out and committing a violent crime. They've tried to, but it's inconclusive. Some researchers believe that this correlation is proof of causation, while others suggest that gaming is more responsible for attitudinal changes with respect to violence and is a poor predictor of violent behavior. Okay. Do researchers have a bias in game studies towards finding a violent link? In the video that you're going to watch for your homework, there's another researcher who's come along and said, yes, they do. So look out for that in your homework. So very often video games are blamed. In recent years, video games have been blamed for causing real-world acts of violence like school shootings. And every time that there is a school shooting, this happens. A fearful establishment will lash out. Every time there's a mass shooting by a young man, a link to video games is made. I'm sure you've seen this yourself. 75% of males under 35 play video games regularly. So that's a pretty significant portion of the population. Can we correlate that all that violence is being caused and is linked to video games when most young people and most men are playing them? Violence in video games. Now, much has been written about the violence in video games, much of it an exaggeration of the dangers for political gain. The media has been quick to demonize gamers in the past, but these attacks have subsided as the industry has become so successful. So this researcher makes this point. This is how the trend line should look if there were a correlation between video game consumption and gun-related murders. Okay, so China should have, which video game consumption has gone through the roof, should see a tremendous gain in all of their video game violence, but they're not. The United States is way up here with their gun-related murders, but it's not correlated to video games. China plays more video games than any other country. They don't have a rise in gun-related murders. Gun-related murders have gone up, but there's not correlated to video game playing. So this attempt to be done has been done in the media. Video games is training. So very often we see video games can become a training for future military service, as we see here in the imagery. In fact, this game called Starfighter, it was in the movie, The Last Starfighter. An Earth boy is recruited by an alien race through a video game placed on Earth to test and train space pilots. Sound familiar? Drone warfare. There's no doubt video game skills translate to drone warfare. Eye-hand coordination, reaction time, and detecting subtle visual clues. The tools used are even similar: joysticks, buttons, and a monitor. So this is not a coincidence. The military is hip to this idea, and they are using video games to train soldiers and even to recruit. So drone warfare is increasingly automated, or just warfare, excuse me, is increasingly automated. It's far more efficient. It doesn't risk sending a precious human into warfare or a precious American coffin back to the US. It's anonymous killing from a computer at headquarters, just like video games. So here we see an example of a drone that was flown from Qatar, struck a target here. Yeah, this is a pretty detailed breakdown of what's going on. And this warfare is increasing. More and more drones are being used. They're much more efficient. Building a drone is a lot cheaper than building an aircraft that needs to keep a human alive with temperature, pressure, and so forth. Entrainment. Many have argued that video games function as training for warfare, which is the argument incidentally made by the Columbine defense attorney, Bill DeCamp. This was the original school shooting case in Columbine. The judge did not allow the argument. This is America's Army. Have you seen this one? America's Army is a series of first-person shooter video games developed and published by the U.S. Army, intended to inform, educate, and recruit prospective soldiers. Launched in 2000, the game was branded as a strategic communication device designed to allow Americans to virtually explore the Army at their own pace, allowing them to determine whether becoming a soldier fits their interests or abilities. And we do have a new version coming out. Also in video games, we see imagining disaster and dystopia. Look at all the various apocalyptic video games. This has become more popular as more people in the society begin to fantasize about apocalyptic endings. As conspiracies have become more popular, we see this more apocalyptic fetish, okay? These games put the player in the perspective of being a survivor in a post-apocalyptic world and hacking their way through zombies, militias, and your neighbors. Survival strategies and awareness must be developed to succeed, but also the ideas of living in a doomed world and competing for resources are instilled. So sure, critical thinking and the thrill of the game, but also it's really giving you a lot of ideations about your own eventual demise and how you'll have to fight everyone for resources. This leads me to this concept of monkey see, monkey do. We learn by watching. Okay, what effects does this have on gamers? Okay, apocalyptic fetish thinking, violent behavior becomes normalized by repeated experience. Behavior and etiquette are modeled. So what we've learned is that this is a recent discovery, is that we have something called mirror neurons. And I have a video in your homework that you're going to watch about that. And a mirror neuron is a neuron that fires both when an animal acts and when the animal observes the same action performed by another. Thus, the neuron mirrors the behavior of the other as though the observer were acting. Okay, so it truly is monkey see, monkey do. You observe someone singing or yawning, and then that is recorded in your brain. It helps you learn to do that. This is how we learn, by observing other people. Okay, and this has been observed in primates, humans, birds. Mirror neurons, learning through imitation. It's thanks to mirror neurons that we learn a lot in the early years: to smile, to ask for help, and in fact, all the behaviors, family and group norms. People learn by what they see and sense in others. Efficient activity of mirror neurons leads to good development in all areas of higher emotional intelligence and the ability to empathize with others. So our point here with video games is that if your primary interaction is through video games, where you're just learning to use characters you encounter in the game to win the game, what are you learning about emotional intelligence? What mirror neurons teach us is that it truly is monkey see, what monkey do. We learn the most in our life by observation, by the triggering of mirror neurons, observing someone else doing something, and then we experience it as if we are ourselves doing it. This, incidentally, is why we can watch a movie or a football game and get so worked up about what's going on the screen. We're not feeling it. We're not in love. We're not losing the championship, but the people in the field are. And that mirror neurons help us empathize and feel that emotion, feel that pride and that fear. So in this way, video games are programming. Video games can act as programming. It trains the player to seek rewards and avoid punishment as a way of life. And many corporations are tapping into this to sell. And here we see, turn your life into an RPG, the gamification project. Here's a jamming the curve, a COVID-19 game. In other words, take unpleasant tasks in life like work or dealing with COVID, turn it into a game. And we call this the gamification of life. And it's the application of game design elements and game concepts to non-game situations, to the rest of your life. It turns all the many tasks of living into a game with rewards and goals. And there's many, many apps that do this. You gamify your chores, your exercise, your homework routine. And there's many geared to people with ADHD. Apparently this is an issue. So Robinhood almost sort of gamified stock investing. There's lots of different ways and programs that will teach you to gamify your life. And businesses are tapping into this. They're seeing chances for profit. So gamification involves finding out about the motivations of end users and tapping into those for profits. Gamification can lead to feelings of being manipulated into doing something you don't want to do. So McDonald's jumped on this. Every time you bought something from McDonald's, you would get a game piece from the Monopoly board. Eventually, you could, I don't know, get more food from McDonald's. One of the key benefits of gamification is getting customers to talk about your brand. So it makes sense to give big rewards for social shares. Okay, so turning going to McDonald's into a game where you win stuff and you play a game, it invests the consumer in the product and invests the consumer in buying more and in the brand. Okay, so we see all these organizations deploy gamification to improve employee engagement by 48%. What about gamifying work? Here's a couple more examples. This is from China. This is called Sesame Credit. It's a social credit system in China. It's a private credit scoring and loyalty system developed by game maker Tencent, who's a huge game maker. This is developed for the Chinese government. It uses data from Alibaba's services to compile its score based on social media interactions and purchases. It also minds your friends and alerts you to those with lower scores and lowers your score for hanging out with them. Social media posts that differ from the party line, that's the Chinese party line, lower your score. Even posting about Japanime will cost you. Okay, so right now it's voluntary, but there's talk of it becoming mandatory. Okay, you're receiving a score for your behavior in society. If you jaywalk and they catch you on camera, your social score can go down. Another example, gotcha games. Okay, these deal in a lot of microtransaction. Gotcha games are video games which encourage players to spend in-game currency for virtual items as they progress. So as you play the game, you buy these various little things and they help you play the game, or they act as an indication of your skill. In-game currency is often different from real-world currency spent to buy it. Children may spend large amounts of money without having any idea of how much they are putting into the game. Okay, a lot of large bills have been racked up playing gotcha games. And, to advance in the game, you need to have certain trinkets, and your gameplay is affected by all these things that you purchase. So it's really just linking commerce for nothing, for digital things, almost like FTPs, linking commerce to advancing in the game. So all this has brought some government regulation. The US has talked about it, but in Korea and China, they've actually done it. There's an anti-addiction system in China. It involves tracking the amount of gameplay and then putting a meter on it. So if they get to a certain point, they can't play anymore. That sounds pretty draconian to us, but both nations have considered this really important. The US put ratings on games in '94, as you see here. But as we'll learn, it doesn't really matter because the youth easily gain access through downloads. A new study conducted in part by Harvard Medical finds that of 12 to 14-year-olds who report frequent video game play, the majority of them play games with mature ratings. Now, how are they able to do that? There are no restrictions placed on who downloads games. When the laws that we see being discussed here, were made, well, guess what? There were, the laws were written in the past when games were bought in stores. So here we see an example of the administration of the legal system really being behind the advances in technology. And now anybody, when someone downloads, they're just not asking, or they're asking, say, hey, are you 18 or 17 plus? Well, you are? Great. Of the 1,100 children who frequently played video games, 48.8% played at least one violent game regularly. So another, and this is one of our final aspects, is youth culture, hacking the system. Younger generations are native to computers and very capable of using them in unintended ways. One of the latest trends is for gamers is actually hacking the video game itself to win. The older generations will call this cheating, but yet younger generations don't object, and this is becoming more common. So the game hack, hacking a game is the process of editing the game's source code in order to gain an advantage. For example, you may hack a game to gain more health or lives. Hacking a game only requires a sufficient understanding of how the game is built and knowing what you need to edit. Here's some of the most common hacks. One of them is an aim hack. So you can actually, make your aim better or other players worse. You can create lag. You can do wall hacks, which allows you to see through walls. So this is, fascinating that when I found out about this, that this is becoming more common. Of course, young people, very sophisticated in games, they could get into the game, get into the code, alter a few things, and really make the game work for them. So is this wrong? This raises all kinds of ethical issues. Is ethical hacking, is it okay? If a player is better able to enjoy a game, if the player applies some cheats, then more power to the player. The whole discussion of we should play the game the designers intended is kind of dumb anyway. That's a very interesting perspective. I don't think the people playing baseball or football would say that about the generations that come before. Usually there's this reverence for what came before. But I think in youth culture today, and indeed in computer culture in general, there's a willingness to hack, to break it open, to invent something new. Keep in mind that computers and technology are constantly evolving. There's always new and better games. In fact, the games themselves come out with a new edition every year or every other year. So there's this culture of improvement. There's a culture of always updating. So why wouldn't it be possible in the minds of the youth to hack the game? Okay. Is hacking cheating? What does it say about gaming culture that hacking has been embraced by young players? Is hacking an example of the disregard for rules in society? Think about that. And my point I'm making is, I wonder if the youth today, because of their exposure to gaming culture and just advancing technology in general, I wonder if an ethos is developing of sort of beating the game, even the game of life, not just the video game in front of you, but essentially hacking the system to get ahead any way you can, especially if you think the system is broken and doesn't work for you. So once a new and superior piece of technology is introduced into an environment, its effects are felt by all. Okay. Once a hack is introduced, its effects are felt by all players. So cell phones, once most of your friends or even a few of your friends started having sophisticated, expensive cell phones, you need to have one. Once the smartphones became ubiquitous, everyone needed one. Technology demands that you keep up. So once game hacks are introduced, cheating becomes part of the game. So you just have to get better at hacking the game yourself. So interesting potential here. To wrap up here, let's talk about video game future. The future is bright for video games as their lifelong fans age up, become more financially established, and spend more money on games and turn their kids onto their favorites. So think about that. All the people who grew up, but people my age who grew up on video games, they're getting older. They have more money. Some of them are continuing to play them. So this is all coming. VR and AR systems are becoming more sophisticated, and younger audiences are showing greater receptivity than their older cohorts. VR kind of flopped in some ways in its initial introduction. It didn't take off the way maybe some people thought it would, but I don't think that'll be true of younger generations. I think that technology is just waiting for a more digitally adapted generation to come along. Video games will be a part of our future, whether we love them or not. They are far too popular to be ignored. Their effects on society are just beginning to be understood. Hopefully, this lesson has provided some of those thoughts. Many of those effects are subtle and hidden, but bear monitoring. These effects will be emerging ever more in society as more generations grow up gaming. The inevitability is certain. All right, let's go to our last question as we end with a quote from Shigeru Miyamoto. Review, popularity and importance. We talked about gamer culture, games and movies relationships, the effects that gaming's having on society. We talked about some disservices, violence in video games, gamification, corporations and starting to gamify our work, education is starting to gamify classes, training for drone warfare, mirror neurons, government regulations, game hacking. So to end, how are video games being used by corporations and governments to access youth culture? Our final question, question 3. How are video games being used by corporations and governments to access youth culture? All right, so I'm going to stop the share. All right, so that's week 10. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I introduced some interesting ideas. That's going to continue in your homework. We're going to watch a video on mirror neurons and also on a couple other interesting aspects of video games. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed that one. Have a great week. Reach out with any questions, and we'll talk to you next week.